What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good day. What is up, y'all? I got another Piers Morgan debate coming in, and hang on before you click off the video right quick. This one's actually a halfway decent debate, to be honest with you. Like, most of the time, I understand Piers Morgan, they're not really debates. You know, it's just a panelist of people screaming at each other, and I generally enjoy doing those. I don't know why. They're just fun to record. I just love refuting some of the idiotic things that people say, some of the just ridiculous, so far off base stuff that people say. It's just fun to just refute all that stuff and to push back and say, look, these are ridiculous ideas. We can't govern like this. We can't talk like this, blah, 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 blah. It just goes on and on and on. I just enjoy those. I just have fun just knocking down the ridiculousness that is Piers Morgan Uncensored. But once again, folks, like I was saying, we actually have a decent debate coming in on this one. It's a completely civil debate, to be honest with you. You got Scott Horton and General Clarke. I'm sorry, it took me a second to spit those names out right there, but got two people coming in. They actually have a pretty good debate, good discourse, so we're going to get into that. But before I run those clips for you right quick, I need y'all to do me a favor and smash that like button. And if you're new around here, I would greatly appreciate it if you could subscribe to this channel. I cover all kinds of stuff, a wide range. Piers Morgan Uncensored, I do other debates, but I mostly cover political news, and I show you guys exactly how you're being manipulated by the corporate press. Yeah, because we are being manipulated on a constant basis. It's pervasive and it's there. So subscribe and share this video anywhere and everywhere you can. But without any further ado, let's get into it, y'all.
May not look like a glorious victory for Russia, but ultimately it is highly likely, I would think, unless you think otherwise, that Ukraine is going to have to cede most, if not all, of the territory that Russia has taken, isn't it?
Well, I don't think there's any reason, nor does it make a good negotiating posture to sort of advance this at this point. I think if you go back and look at this, first of all, the U.S. intelligence agencies failed from the beginning to really appreciate what was going on in Ukraine. We didn't have coverage. The diplomats didn't understand that Ukraine was a different country than Russia. Most of the people that studied the Soviet Union went to Moscow after the war. They didn't go to Ukraine. They took the Russian view of it. And so we had really sort of bad guidance at the outset. In 2014, the United States basically said, well, you know, Ukraine can't defend itself. Just give up Crimea. We told them to give up Crimea. That wasn't enough. Putin then decided he would try to take Donbass. When I was over there on the 31st of March, 1st, 2nd, 3rd of April of 2014, Ukrainians came to me and said, we have 50,000 people. We stayed in Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia. We held those against the Party of Regions, which was the Yanukovych's party, the Russian party there. We defended it. We fought for 30 days. We stayed. We wouldn't let them have the administration. So there was a widespread effort. The United States really wasn't engaged in it, didn't understand it, didn't have much to do with it, really. Victoria Nuland sort of spoke out of turn. She got chastised for that. Obama was trying to use Putin to help with Iran. And suddenly this thing, you know, pops up like, what the hell? We had already outsourced our foreign policy in Europe essentially to Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel, you know, in the way the Europeans do, they sort of blunder in, well, let's all get together and share our interests. And of course, Putin is a geostrategist. He's not an economist. He doesn't care about trade. He wants territory. And from the time he became the president in 2000, he wanted to take over the space of the Soviet Union. He still does. So there've been a lot of misestimates, and I wouldn't quote Mike Mullen or Mark Milley, although they're both good men. They weren't there. They weren't on the ground. They didn't see the intensity of the Ukrainians' resistance. As to what happens now, I think there's still determination in Ukraine to stay and fight. This is about whether there's going to be a Ukraine or not. Now, Putin does believe he's going to win. There's no doubt about that. he thinks that, and he's not going to say, oh, okay, I'm ready for negotiations because I've lost a few troops. This is Mother Russia. They lost half of Russia to the Germans. They still won. So he is fully engaged in this. And this is going to be the great challenge for Donald Trump. If he wants to make America great, he can't do it by sacrificing Europe, because Europe is the geostrategic prize that both Russia and China crave. And Europe is there for the Americans right now. Now, you may not want to think in terms of geostrategy. Most Americans don't, but most of the rest of the world does. And so I think when Donald Trump is speaking, and I heard him speak on the last interview he made, and he talked about NATO, he sounds pretty strong. I think he's going to recognize that he's going to have to find a win-win solution out of this.
Right.
And it can't simply be that we abandon Ukraine. Putin wants all of Eastern Europe back, and he wants the rest of Europe neutralized. And look, Europe has population, it has technology, it has investment resources, it has markets, it's everything that China wants, and it's also what Russia wants, and it wants us. So if you want to be the great leader of the world, to take what's there that we already have. We have to find the ways through this. And so I wouldn't start by saying it's inevitable that Ukraine has to give up half its territory or something like this. Let's let the reinforcing forces go in. Let's not talk defeatism at this stage. Let's not let Putin talk us into the inevitability of Russian victory. It's only inevitable if we believe it's inevitable.
Okay, so I'm not sure when the shift was when General Clarke right here turned into a neocon, but I don't know if you guys remember. I didn't pay attention that much to politics back in the day, but I do remember General Clarke actually trying to push for peace agreements with Russia instead of NATO expansionism. This is something Scott Horton has talked about in the past. This was something that General Clarke actually pushed really hard for, and now he seems to be on the opposite side of this thing. He keeps constantly talks about, oh, how Putin wants Europe and Putin wants this and Putin wants that. Well, we got to look at several key issues here. Does he have the ability to take Ukraine? Right? He hasn't shown that ability. Does he have the ability to roll into Poland? Right? Does he have the ability to rule Europe, for crying out loud? Right? Like we have Article 5. And I'm sure, Putin, he might be whatever the hell you might think he is. An evil dictator. He just wants land. He wants territory. He wants this. He wants his intelligence forces all over the world. But, wanting and having the ability to implement all these things are vastly different, right? So we're not looking at defeatism like he was saying, like, oh, well, we're going to have to cede territory. Yeah, we might have to do that. That's called reality, right? You look at what's going on the ground, right? What we are trying to get into this, right? And this is something they talk about. Oh, well, if you talk about, not wanting to supply Ukraine with weapons, then you're a Putin propagandist. If you say anything about NATO encroachment into the Russian sphere of influence, you're a Putin propagandist. Oh, that's just Russian talking points. No, that just happens to be reality. We're looking at what actually happened. It's called actuality, as a matter of fact. This is what happened, okay? We weren't supposed to expand eastward, and that's all we have done. We are pushing the buttons of Russia. Now, the thing we have to balance here is, does Russia have the ability to push back? Well, that's what they're attempting to do here in Ukraine. Now, General Clarke, he loves to get into, if we're the leaders of the world, we need to show strength. Well, there's a difference between just sending weapons and billions of dollars to a corrupt nation and showing strength on the world stage. There's a vast difference. Those are two different things. We can show plenty of strength without funding war, right? I say this all the time. We can show strength. We don't have to fund Ukraine, right? Like, to be honest with you, I understand. I get the argument here, right? Ukraine's a democracy, but the thing is, how do we root out Putin at this point? What do we do? Like, the only thing I can see that we can do, honestly, is for NATO to roll into Ukraine. And at this point, Ukraine's not part of NATO. So technically, we have no business doing so. And if we were to do that, we would be just as bad as the aggressors in this instance. And I don't see an argument the other way around, to be honest with you, right? We would have to, once again, do what he's saying and keep pushing Putin's buttons until he makes the first move. And then at this point, sitting back looking at it and like zoom out a little bit morally, what is the freaking difference here? Honestly, if we're going to push Putin's buttons until he does something that crosses that line, like, come on, like, where's the argument against this? Why do we need to do this? Why do we need to be the leader of the world and push somebody's buttons until they make a move? Why don't we just, if we're going to do that, why don't we just go ahead right now, declare war, and just take over Ukraine? We invade Ukraine. Like, these people just don't make any sense. You come to the negotiating table and you negotiate peace, for crying out loud. Right? Like, there was an opportunity early on in this thing for us to do that. And we did nothing. I'll say we did nothing. We roll that back a little bit. As a matter of fact, we went in and said, okay, we're going to fight Russia till the bloody end. Like, I've discussed this several times before, right? This is the most ridiculous, strategy, in my opinion. We're going to fight. We're not even fighting Russia. Like, it's Ukraine people that are going off to war to be just thrown into the meat grinder, if you will. It's ridiculous, these people. And they want to continue doing this instead of trying to bring, the fighting to a stop, have some kind of ceasefire agreement, blah, 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 then work out your territory later. Right? Like, I don't think we need to cede ground. I think there's room to negotiate this thing and not have to cede any territory to Russia. I think there's a possibility, and it's a slim possibility of that, considering where we're at now. But if we would have done this early on, I think we would have been in a much better place. But we've got some more from General Clarke, so let's keep going, y'all.
First of all, I wouldn't have said the surge would work in Afghanistan. From the beginning, yeah. I said there was the right plan in Afghanistan. I was against the invasion of Iraq. It's not something the U.S. needed to do, and an occupation is not something the U.S. Army can do, especially not in a Muslim country. So let's forget about, for a minute, the comparison between Afghanistan, Iraq, and Ukraine. That's irrelevant. What's relevant here is how you want to shape the future of Europe for the United States' best benefit. And if you believe the best benefit is to simply accede to Russia's supposed superiority, then I can show you all the documents in which Putin has said he wants one space from the Atlantic to Vladivostok. And if you look at the December 2021 documents, he wants the neutralization. He wants NATO rolled back to pre-1997. He wants the countries in Eastern Europe out of NATO. He wants to reestablish control over the Baltics. And as the generals in Moscow told me in 1995, when we were going to put the first NATO force into Bosnia, he said, "You're coming into our part of Europe." And there was never any question about it. And it's not just Putin, it's the way Russia thinks. It's Russian imperialism. So the Balkans is their part of Europe. They're working very hard right now with Mr. Vucic and Dodik in Republika Srpska to cause problems there and make difficulties for the Dayton Peace Agreement, which Richard Holbrooke and our team helped negotiate and bring to a conclusion. And so, yes, they have ambitions. And if you talk to the people in the region, they understand this very well, that it's not just about Ukraine or Moldova or Georgia. Just over the weekend, people from Georgia are calling me and said, you got to help Georgia. I mean, they're taking over. And they've got about 20% of Georgia they occupied after 2008. They move the markers about 100 meters every 6 months or a year in Georgia and challenge the Georgians to resist it. And Georgia wants to be part of the West. That's why there's hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating. And yet, if the West is silent, if we don't use our influence there, yes, Putin will take it. It's not what people want. And so it comes back to, how do you view the role of the United States? Are we a nation that can try to help others reach what we have and what they aspire to? Or are we just an historic anomaly that should shrink back in and say, oh, thank goodness we're protected by two oceans? Because we know those two oceans don't work anymore. They worked for a long time. If you want safety and security, if you want our values, if you want democracy, you have to be able to have a foreign policy that reaches out with all the elements of national power beyond the borders of America. If you want to make America great again, as Donald Trump says he wants to do, he's going to have to face the fact, as H.R. McMaster said the other day, look, it's not just Russia, it's not just Europe, it's Iran, it's North Korea, it's China, it's Russia. They work increasingly closely together to confound and disrupt and reduce America's influence in the world. And that's bad for everyone in this country. I'm sorry about Afghanistan. I'm sorry about Iraq. I'm sorry about all the military men we left over there that died over there, the mistakes that were made by the Pentagon. I wasn't there. If I had been, I think it would have been different. But, you know, most of these mistakes that have been made by politicians. And in the case of Ukraine, President Obama never understood it. He'd outsourced our foreign policy, as I said, to Germany. He was facing toward Asia. They didn't get it. President Biden, I would have counseled, and I tried to counsel publicly, when you meet Putin in Geneva, tell him no. Tell him you're not going to be able to advance. We already knew in the spring of 2021 that he was planning to attack Ukraine. We could have said to him, you go into Ukraine, we're going to do everything we can to stop you, and we will stop you. Instead, we said, well, we hope you'll be a gentleman and a statesman. That's not using American power. I hope Donald Trump, and I think he does, understand the use of power. You have to use power in this world. And we're coming to, it's what Xi Jinping told Putin a year and a half ago. He said, change is not seen in 100 years, and we are driving it. Well, we've had 75 pretty good years since the Second World War. If we like the world as it's emerged, if we like mostly a rule of law, if we like travel, if we like relatively corrupt-free government, relatively open opportunities to express differences of opinion, then you're going to have to stand up for those values and fight for them, because you're not going to have them in China or Russia, or if China and Russia have control over the United States.
I really can't stand this idea that these people put on display, like there's these only two options that we have here. We either push our military-industrial complex and force people into democracy, into our way of governing things, our way of life and all this other stuff, or we shrivel back into our corner of the world and that's it. No. That's not it. We can push ourselves upon these places, lead by example. If we're going to be the leaders of the free world, we lead by example. We make these countries want to be like the United States, right? And this idea that just because these countries in Eastern Europe cry out for our help, that means we have to go in and, bring them into NATO and say, if you're attacked, blah, 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 Article 5 gets triggered and all this other good stuff. No, it doesn't have to be like this. We can negotiate peace deals with these people. We can work these things out, trade agreements, right? That's one of the major things, right? That's something that keeps people from going to war, is trade agreements, because you don't want to disrupt those trade agreements, especially when both sides benefit greatly. And I think that's one reason Donald Trump is so good, right? Because he works these negotiations out. He'll put tariffs on you and then negotiate from that standpoint, from a standpoint standpoint of power through economic power, right? The soft power battle instead of military battles, right? This is something that Donald Trump is good at, right? Like, I can't stand how General Clarke comes in here and says, well, if you want to make America great again, our tanks need to roll into Moscow. Like, no, dude. No, not at all. Why can't we have economic trade with all these countries? Why does Russia and China and all these places have to be adversarial just because they don't have our set of values and our set of democracy and all this other garbage that these people love to spit out? Like, and then they tug on your heartstrings. Oh, we've got to help these small countries in Eastern Europe and blah, 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 blah. Like, why can't we have all of it? There is room for this, right? I understand China is trying to push us out. Well, we need to push back economically, not necessarily militarily, right? I don't understand. Like, of course, this has to work two ways. We have to have somebody on the other side willing to negotiate these things, right? And if you're not willing to negotiate, then, war is inevitable, and I totally understand that. But I do think that in its own interests, places like Russia, China, Iran, all these other places, right? You get to a certain point where if it's beneficial to both parties, if both parties are going to be able to prosper from these ideas and these trade agreements and all these negotiations, I think it's in their own best interest to go ahead and go that route instead of trying to buck the system, buck the United States, and try to go against the United States, right? All we need to do is worry about ourselves militarily, right? If we have the strongest military in the world, if we have the capability to take on 2 or 3 fronts at the exact same time, this has worked for us so far for the past, since World War II. For the past, was that 75, 80 years now? Something like that. Right, this has worked so far, and I just don't think this route of, like, I do agree with him. He gets into talking about how Biden just kind of kowtowed and just said, oh, well, Putin, you better not do it, and didn't do a damn thing about it, right? Until Putin invades Ukraine. I think he's right about that. Biden should have stood up and said, look, we're going to do this if you do this. Try to stop him from doing that. But no, he just stood back pretty much and allowed Putin to roll into Ukraine. And then he puts the sanctions out there. And then we just endlessly fund another war, like another proxy war, for crying out loud. That's ridiculous. This would have, once again, Trump says this, would have never happened under Donald Trump. I totally believe that, because I think Trump would have said, we'll nuke the crap out of you if you do this. And once again, it goes back to this old saying, is that people say all the time that if you're not sure if Trump is really going to push that button, if there's a 5% chance that he pushes that button, that's enough of a disincentivization. I don't even know if that's a real word. Disincentivization. Screw it. I made it up, like legitical. But it disincentivizes Putin from making that choice because he doesn't know exactly what's going to happen, right? That's projecting power. That's an over projection of power, right? Now, at some point, that will become a detriment, because if you keep on crying wolf, in other words, you keep on saying, I'm going to do this, and then you never do anything, eventually somebody's going to take you up on that. But, in the meantime, I do believe that works. But once again, we have to harken back to trade negotiations. We need to work hand in hand with these people instead of having an adversarial relationship with all these countries. I don't get that. I understand Iran hates us. And hey, look, we can excise them from the world, economic trade routes and all this other stuff. We can boot them out if we want to. We have the power to do that. Do I think we need to? No, I don't. I think all these countries need to be able to get along together, but that's kind of naive. It's kind of a dream world. But look, once again, if there's incentivizations there, once again, I love that word. I love making up words. It's something I do as a hobby. I know that's a weird hobby, but if we can incentivize Iran that it's in their own best interest to work economically with all these countries, to work with us over here in the West, just because we don't have the same values, right? That's something that we need to do on our part as well. We need to respect these people's governments. We need to respect the fact that, yeah, sure, they do some things that we see as atrocities, but hey, all we can do is lead by example. We have zero right to go in and force these people into our way of life. I just can't see that as a reality that has any sort of good solutions, like any good outcomes, in other words, right? They're gonna fight back. Just look at what we've done in the Middle East as proof to this, right? There's all these insurgent groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, you name them, right? There's several. The Hezbollah, all these places, right? They buck the system. They don't want our way of life. And look, that's something we might have to deal with. Just because they do stuff that we see as, as like morally irreparable, just reprehensible, if you will. Trying to find the correct words here. That's a reality of this world, right? Until we evolve further as a species, we're not going to be able to eliminate all these things. We can't force these people to change their ways of life. That's something I totally understand. But some of these people don't seem to get. They seem to think, damn, having my way with words today, but they seem to think that we can force democracy on everybody, enforce our rule of law upon everybody. Yeah, that's not how life works. You can't do that. Fascism doesn't work. And I don't think we need to be exporting fascism, right? I think we need to be exporting peace, for God's sakes, because we can do it. We have the manpower, we have the technology, and we have the ability to change this world for the better. But I don't think we can do that by shipping weapons to Ukraine, for crying out loud, right? Like funding insurgent groups in Yemen or all these other Middle Eastern countries. I just don't think that's the way to do it. I don't think sending a team of CIA agents to coup a government, for crying out loud, is any good way, especially when it gets found out about, to have a standing on the world that is respected by all. Right? Like, this doesn't work. We need to stop doing this. I just don't get this idea of us needing to undermine governments just because we don't agree with them. Right? This just doesn't make any sense. It's when people start taking military action, that's when we can intervene militarily. Right? Like taking military action against us. Right? You invade a sovereign nation. Hey, we happen to have a peace agreement with these people. Then we go in and do whatever the hell we got to do, right? But I just don't like this idea of war, and I think if we need to do every single thing we can to try to prevent war, but we don't do that, do we? No. We try to push buttons and, let's encroach upon Russia and let's antagonize China and all this other garbage, blah, 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 blah. You get it, right? We just talked about the other day at length about Taiwan. We're selling weapons to Taiwan. I have no problem with that. I made it a point to make China look ridiculous on that instance, right? Like, China seems to think that Taiwan is part of China. It's part of mainland China. Well, hang on. If they're buying weapons from us, why are they getting mad about that? They're acquiring more weapons, for crying out loud. Like, what's your problem? You're getting more weapons here. Don't get it, but we all know the reality of this, right? We all know that Taiwan is an independent nation. If they want to buy arms from us, China can't do a damn thing about it. But that goes to break down that narrative that China seems to think that they can rule Taiwan with an iron fist when they can't. They know they can't. They never have. They never will. Right? It's just not going to be allowed to happen. We can do whatever we can before military intervention to try to prevent that. And we need to do that. But military intervention, I think, should be off the table. I really do, because I think there's a way without it. That might be slightly naive, but hang on. Is it so naive? There is a way around these things. China claims to want to be able to do this peacefully. Well, you know what? that's not going to happen, buddy, because once you have independence, yet you don't like being ruled over by a dictatorship. So that's not going to happen, China. You need to get that out of your brain, right? And hey, look, I respect where it's due. China has built itself up. It's rivaling the United States in certain areas. And hey, that's great for them. But if they're going to be leaders of the world, then maybe they should look within, clean their own doorstep up before trying to take over other nations, if you will, right? Like, that's not how the world works, by the way. I know how it has worked in the past, right? Military might, that's what ruled the world, but you know, we're coming into an age where everything's connected. Everybody has information right there at their fingertips. So you can't just invade another nation and say, oh, well, they were doing evil stuff. No. It doesn't work like that anymore. Sure, people do evil things, but there's always two sides to a story, and everything is not so black and white. There's always shades of gray, if you will, just like with Ukraine and Russia. There's shades of gray, right? But the way our Western media tries to portray this thing is that, you know, everything that Russia done was bad and everything that we're doing is good, which, no, I'm sorry, that's just BS outright, and we can't live that way. We're not going to buy into that narrative. That is garbage. We don't need to be exporting our democracy and trying to force it onto other people, and we need to stop doing that before we can tell other countries that, hey, they need to clean up their stuff, right? We shouldn't be doing that. I just don't think we should be doing that. But I went on for way too long. But I hope y'all enjoyed the video. I hope you guys had a very, very Merry Christmas. And y'all let me know what y'all think about all this. Am I off base on this? Or do you think this is where we need to be as far as our foreign policy is try to promote peace as much as possible. And hey, you know, if it devolves into a bloody conflict, then it is what it is. We should keep ourselves out of it. But that's where I stand. Let me know where you stand. That's all I got for this one. I want to thank everybody for watching, and y'all try to have a good day. Stay legitical. Peace.